Good morning, everyone, and welcome yet again to this, I say, final webinar stroke online event in our monthly events series for 2020/2021. And of course, if like me, you struggle a bit with the impact of COVID-19 on the flow of time and realizing just where we are, of course. Well, today is the 23rd of June, 2021. And of course, it marks 5 years since the June 2016 referendum, which delivered a small majority leave vote on the question of should we remain in the European Union. And so, of course, now here we are 5 years later. It's also approximately 6 months since we left the single market and customs union, where, of course, Brexit began to have a practical impact. Since then, we now have new trade barriers in the form of a customs regime and the need for checks on goods moving between the UK and the EU. And of course, key in that current issue stroke conundrum is the status of Northern Ireland, in particular with the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol of Withdrawal Agreement. So much to talk about today, but in advance of that, I thought I would just share a few things with you. So we call this Brexit health check, and what we're trying to do today in terms of our esteemed panel of speakers, who I'll get onto in a minute, is to sort of look at the current lie of the land, if you like, in terms of impact on the economy. So we have our own David Hearn focusing on the impact on the West Midlands, trying to draw some preliminary conclusion to the impact of Brexit. And then, of course, we have a visiting Professor David Bailey and esteemed Senior Fellow with the UK and a Changing Europe Initiative, bringing his usual sharp and incisive insights into the current lie of the land and the impact on manufacturing, and I guess automotive in particular, given David's interests. And then we'll round out this morning's session with visiting professor here at BCU, Vicki Price. Vicki, of course, will be familiar to many of our listeners as well. And Vicki is going to do a sort of wider check on the economic landscape and the international aspects, if you like, consider wider implications around trade, investment, prospect of further trade deals, and so on. So, yeah, it's fair to say that Brexit has been a seismic shock. And whilst last year, of course, in particular, has been dominated by the impact of COVID-19 on the UK economy and indeed the wider world, Brexit, of course, has the significant, I don't say potential, it's actual, that its long-run impact is likely to dwarf that of COVID. And of course, in terms of the actual dynamics of the relationship at the moment, no pun intended here, of course, but relations between the UK and the EU remain frosty. And of course, Northern Ireland is a particular sticking point, as I mentioned earlier, with the implementation of the protocol requiring, in effect, checks on goods moving into Northern Ireland from the UK, if, of course, they are deemed capable of travelling onwards to the Republic of Ireland. And indeed, much of the current tension, if you like, revolves around those. But of course, that's one aspect, a key aspect, clearly, with its potential for, well, not potential, with its impact so far in upsetting key elements of the unionist community there. Of course, we now have Sir Geoffrey Donaldson coming in to be the new DUP leader, who is wanting to tear up the Northern Ireland Protocol. I might well say good luck on that one. You might want to tear up your council tax bill, but the reality is it's still there, it's going to remain there, and there are no better alternatives. But we may touch on that again later. And of course, the pattern is repeated in other areas. Of course, we've managed to get data adequacy with the EU for the moment in terms of, the status of cross-border data transfers. Some of you may have noticed, for example, a recent report co-authored by Ian Duncan Smith and George Freeman calling for the UK to ditch GDPR as its established strictures around data transfer and replace it with its own. Again, I would say good luck on that one. Having been locked into a trade agreement with the EU that calls for regulatory alignment in anything that may affect trade and investment, I would suggest that cross-border data flows and of course, the nature of services trade would be a key sticking point that would make such desires to pursue regulatory divergence somewhat pie in the sky. But again, our panel of speakers may have more to say about those. So, of course, Financial services, another key sector for the UK, far more so than fishing, which of course have dominated headlines over the last 12 months. Will we get full financial equivalence? You know, that remains in the gift of the EU to grant. I'm somewhat lacking in full optimism in that regard. So despite the fact that we have a trade agreement in place, of course, there remain outstanding areas and further negotiations will clearly be required. In terms of trying to ascertain public perceptions, though, this to me seems somewhat incongruent, although one may well sum up this statement in terms of people favour the status quo. So actually, 5 years on, few people appear to have changed their minds. You know, we're still looking at roughly about a 52-48% split. Now, the data suggests that a rerun would give the reverse result in terms of should we have left the EU, with a small majority saying no, we shouldn't. But if you ask people, should we rejoin the EU, then we get something like 53% saying no. So explain that result if you will, but it seems people appear to favour the status quo. So I suppose in that sense, to me, that is somewhat surprising. But, you know, to revisit an earlier point, the full impact of Brexit, particularly in the last 12 months, has been shielded, if you like, by the impact of COVID-19. So where COVID, of course, had acted to dampen demand and disrupt supply chains, that in itself would serve to mask some of the effects of Brexit. And of course, at the moment, we still don't have the full import check regime in place for goods coming into the UK from Europe. Now, key examples here that you might wish to think of, course, are fresh fruit and vegetables coming in from Spain. So the government, of course, has been dragging its heels in that regard, and as yet we don't have that regime in place. So again, a key point here is that the full impact of Brexit is yet to be felt. Trade deals, I hope Vicki will cover that in some more detail and give her usual insights into those. But being Australian, of course, I can't help but comment on a trade deal with Australia. Trade with Australia, of course, is only about 2% of the UK total. You could double that, and double and nothing is still nothing. But of course, much of the coverage in the media has centred around the impact on UK farming and, of course, phasing in tariff reductions for Australian, in particular, meat exports over the 15-year period may have deleterious impacts on UK farmers who can't compete on the basis of cost with those bigger producers. One peculiar stat I found was that in Australia there are, I think, 7 farms bigger than UK counties. Imagine that for the scale of the competition that we're dealing with there. That trade deal, of course, in terms of meat exports would have preponderant impact on Scottish and Welsh farmers of lamb and beef, which of course feeds into the final bullet point here. The political environment facing the future of the UK. Of course, in Scotland, in the Holyrood Scottish Parliament, we have an SNP government with a working majority with support of the Scottish Greens, who of course support Scottish independence. So the SNP will at some point in the next year or two put forward a bill to instigate another referendum on Scottish independence. Now, of course, how Westminster reacts to that will be pivotal, because Westminster retained the power to block that in legal terms, at least, in other words, to make it non-binding. So it remains to be seen what will happen there. But of course, Nicola Sturgeon has promised to make recovery from COVID a priority. So that in itself looms large on the horizon. And polls in Scotland suggest roughly a 50-50 split at this point. A few months ago, they were somewhere approaching 60-40 in favour of independence. So clearly, going forward then, the nature of how the UK performs and the relations between the UK government and Scotland, and indeed the perceived impact on the Scottish economy, bear in mind fishing and farming have been 2 sectors that have really impacted on Scottish farmers. And it becomes a very interesting political environment. And now, before we go to our speakers, if there are any of you out there, particularly in manufacturing in the region, or indeed in the rest of England or the UK, we at the CBS are currently conducting a survey, another survey, if you like, with our partners in Germany at the Hochschule Institute in Bremen, looking at UK-German manufacturing linkages and producers. And we would particularly love to hear from you. We have a survey link here that you can fill out. I would encourage you, please come forward and do so to particularly tell us about impacts between the UK and Germany, who of course, is a key manufacturing trade partner. The link is provided here. We will have this link posted on our website after today's event. So if you're out there, please, I'd encourage you to fill that in. Or if you know of if you have colleagues or contacts working in these sectors, aerospace, automotive, medical technologies, we would encourage you, please, to get them to log on and fill in this survey. It only takes about 10 minutes, but it's been invaluable in the past in helping us to inform regional policy in terms of impact on supply chains and Brexit preparedness, or indeed the impact after Brexit. So we're now going to go over to our speakers. I'm going to introduce our first speaker now, who is David Hearn. David is a researcher here at the Centre for Brexit Studies. He has a particular expertise in subnational prices, in other words, purchasing power parity between different parts of the UK. But today he's going to provide us with an update on the impact potentially to date of Brexit on the West Midlands economy and labour market. So David, without further ado, over to you. So I'm going to stop sharing that.
Thank you very much, Alex. Right.
Can I just do some housekeeping first? Sorry, yes, please keep your mobile phones on silent. Try to keep noises from Outlook down, of course, in terms of the usual protocol. You can post questions in our chat forum. Questions will keep until the end. Each speaker will get 15 minutes approximately. We aim to wrap up by about 10:30. And of course, whilst I don't expect this to happen this morning, any otherwise offensive language or inappropriate terminology can result in people being kicked off the platform, but I'm sure that won't happen today. So David, thank you there. Sorry, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so moving swiftly onwards, I've endeavoured to share my screen. Please let me know if there are any issues. It should be a full screen PowerPoint presentation. So this morning, I'm going to look at Brexit trade in the West Midlands, and particularly just to put forward some very, very early initial reflections on some of the issues that we see here. And to point out really the length of time it's going to take us to fully see how this plays out in real detail. So 5 years on from the referendum, investment since 2016 appears to have slowed, and I'll point out some of the evidence there. Trade figures are extremely erratic, and I'll look at ways in which we can perhaps try and get some useful and interesting information from trade figures that otherwise are extremely erratic, that sort of bounce up and down all over the place. And finally, I'm going to look at the West Midlands labour market very briefly, and just point out the kind of time period we're going to need to understand the impact of Brexit on our region. So, investment. This is a chart of investment since 2006. The orange bars, the first orange bar marks, broadly speaking, the start of what we call the Great Recession. That's the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So what we see is fairly obviously, I suppose, a fall in business investment during that recessionary period. And then a steady recovery. So we get a steady recovery that sort of stops really quite abruptly in the second quarter of 2016, and that's the period of the EU referendum. And then what we see from 2016 onwards is a flatlining in business investment. Now that's really quite interesting, and one of the reasons that's interesting is because it differs so completely from experience elsewhere on the European continent, where we see this recovery, we see the same trend of fall in business investment, recovery in business investment, but that recovery continues. So if you look at Germany, for example, or France, you'll see a recovery in business investment, whereas the UK sees this kind of flatlining. COVID is again very, very obvious in the chart, and that's the third yellow bar that I pointed out there. So you see the huge cratering in business investment. But the interesting point there is that looks like that's going to rapidly return to normal as we see lockdowns lifted and hopefully the pandemic ending. Whereas the Brexit effect really does seem to be some kind of longer term permanent shift in business investment. So the evidence here is indicative, it's not conclusive. We can't say with absolute certainty, but what we can say is that we have some indication that Brexit has depressed investment since 2016. We see very, very uneven exposure. We see certain sectors, for example, automotive, that prior to the agreement of the trade deal, at least, were potentially highly exposed. And we saw, and David, I know, will be able to talk about this in much more detail, but we saw from very, very high levels of investment in 2015, a really quite severe fall in investment in the automotive sector. Hopefully that will recover, but that's something that we saw in quite some extreme. In contrast, we saw the construction sector, which is obviously much less exposed to Brexit. We saw continued growth. We saw that trend in business investment in the construction sector, at least, just continued on upwards. So that's a sector that's much less exposed to Brexit, at least in trading terms. And we saw ongoing investment there. I've spoken already about post-16 growth. I'll point you in the direction in particular of work by Paul Meisen and Nicholas Bloom, which was a very, very big survey, large funded survey of UK companies. And I think that their work suggests a fall in the order of about 10%. So 10% of business investment that would otherwise have occurred has not occurred as a result of Brexit. Now, again, that's survey evidence. I'm not going to say that's absolutely certain, 100% conclusive, but it's another piece of indicative evidence that suggests that Brexit has slowed the pace of investment. So moving on to trade. Now, this is where things get very interesting because we're faced with an extremely erratic trade series, and I'm going to try and decompose that. So we'll focus on exports here, partly because the UK has not imposed any import checks yet on imports from the European Union. So exports are really where you'd expect to see this kind of impact, at least for now. We're going to look at trading goods because partly that's easy because that's easier to assess, that's easier to estimate, but also partly because that's the area that's more exposed, and because that's where we have the more recent figures available. Trade in services takes a little while longer to come through. So as you can see, trade figures are extremely erratic. I've looked at the EU and the rest of the world. These are all exports, and these are all in current prices. What do we make of these erratic series? Well, first of all, we'll exclude non-monetary gold. So I'm excluding gold that's transferred between usually major banks, it has to be said. Now that affects trade figures. It's GDP neutral. It doesn't affect GDP, but it does affect trade, and it tends to come into the country and go out of the country and into the country and out of the country. Renders trade figures very erratic. It particularly affects non-EU figures. So if you look at this enormous spike in the orange bar here, that's mostly related to non-monetary gold. That's big transfers. This gold very rarely actually physically moves. It's usually held in a vault in the UK, Switzerland, the US, whatever. So looking at this focus on exports, I'm going to decompose this into three parts. A seasonal part. Christmas happens every year. We see notable seasonal differences in UK trade, UK exports, for very obvious reasons. I'll look at the trend, which will kind of move over time if you think of that as a moving average. And then random variation, which should expose some of the impacts of Brexit, COVID, and perhaps allow us to understand which of those two effects is predominating. So looking particularly at exports to the EU, here we have trend and seasonal factors. So this graph here, the trend, if you like, is the blue line here, and that's a very it's just a smoothed series. The seasonal factors are things that we can derive from the data that appear to repeat every year. They appear the same, and if you actually look at that in detail, you can copy and paste that from period to period. It remains the same. You see the same shapes every year. This boost in trade during the fourth quarter. The boost in exports in particular during the fourth quarter, unsurprisingly. And here's the erratic component. And this is really interesting because you see near the very beginning of the series, I haven't marked this out, but that's kind of financial crisis time. So you see this jump around that's related to the financial crisis. But since Brexit really became real, trade has become increasingly erratic. Trade with the EU, this is. So this is exports to the European Union. That first dot, that's the first Brexit deadline. So if you think back into ancient history, 2018, Theresa May, 2019, sorry, Theresa May, that's Theresa May's first deadline. That's her Easter deadline. And you'll remember that it looked like the UK might crash out of the EU with no trade deal, no agreement, no deal whatsoever. And what we see is businesses getting all of their exports in, so to speak, to the EU during that period, just prior to that deadline. Now, immediately after that deadline, we see trade move the other direction. So we see this kind of large fall in trade, in exports to the European Union, presumably because that's catch up. That's people saying, oh, thank goodness for that. We don't need to, we can unwind some of this effect. We don't need to stockpile as much, etc. The second dot is the second Brexit deadline. So that's the no deal deadline that appeared in September, October of that year. And the third dot was the final deadline that eventually we sort of didn't hit because we had the general election of 2019, and that obviously resulted in a government with a working majority who signed the Brexit agreement, and the rest is ancient history. The fourth dot is the impact of the first lockdown. So that's COVID. And what we see there is a big drop off in trade. Now that is the only one here that's also visible in trade with the rest of the world. So that's a universal thing. And interestingly, what we see is that manufacturing exports at least actually recover quite quickly from that. Now, the fifth dot, that's that up here. That is the coming into the deadline for the UK leaving the single market and customs union. So again, what we see here is stockpiling on the European side. We see British exporters getting their exports in early before this enormous fall in trade, far larger than anything else in either this series or the rest of the world series, which is the final dot. And that's Brexit proper. Now, what we don't know is what things will look like moving forward. We seem to have got a recovery, an initial recovery, but are we going to see a slower trend? Are we going to see a change in the trend of export growth? So that's the kind of big unknown. We know that we saw a huge hit in January. We know that hit has largely unwound through to April, which is the most recent of these figures. But what we don't know is what the trend is going to look like moving forward, because it's certainly true that there are additional costs in moving goods in and out of the country. And it's certainly true that smaller firms in particular have struggled with this. So large producers are, I say, okay in most cases, more or less okay. Smaller producers are really struggling. Now, to zoom in on the West Midlands, we don't have trade data for the West Midlands yet. The first quarter will come out in July. But what we do have is the ability to sort of say, okay, well, what kind of environment is Brexit coming in on? The West Midlands labour market looks a lot like the labour market in the rest of the UK. It's hit similarly to the rest of the country. Ignore London. London is its own universe, really. But this is in an environment where unemployment was already elevated. So unemployment, we came into the crisis with unemployment elevated above what it was in the rest of the UK, and it has stayed above the rest of the UK. But the sort of change, if you like, that's more or less in line with what we've seen in the rest of the country. We are in a strongly pro-Brexit environment. This is a look at the Leave vote across the West Midlands by ward. And you'll note that most of the West Midlands, where we have data available, voted in favour of leaving the EU. There's just a small number of wards, mostly around central Birmingham, that voted to remain. And you'll see the particularly strong Leave votes around the Black Country. So that's Dudley, moving up into especially Walsall, actually, where you've got this very strong pro-Leave vote, and the same in eastern parts of Birmingham. So we're in an environment that's strongly pro-Brexit. That has, if you like, shaped certain responses to policy, and many of these seats are what you might think of as red wall seats. So it's too early to tell the longer term impact on the region. There's definitely some evidence of manufacturing downsizing. At the moment, that's anecdotal rather than detailed survey evidence, but it's enough to tell us this is probably happening. We know for a fact that SMEs are struggling to trade. Larger businesses much less so, but we know that SMEs are struggling to get things in and out of the country. We know that the additional costs are hitting a lot of smaller firms. There are real difficulties there, and some of them have been teething difficulties, but most of them are not. Most of them it is purely it is what it is. It's the new environment we live in. It's the environment that has been shaped by this political landscape I showed on the page before, and by the policies of the UK government. And from a business perspective, it's what you have to live with. It is what it is. There are sector specificities. Certain things, agriculture has been hit much harder than a lot of other sectors, but again, that depends what you do within agriculture. Some things are universal, trading costs, VAT, etc., but a lot of things are sector specific. So we have some initial data, trade data for the UK available now. That suggests that there was an initial enormous hit from Brexit. That particular hit has unwound, but there are question marks over the longer term trend. We will see regional trade data for Q1 in July. That will show an enormous hit for Q1. We knew that. We can see that from the national data. It's obvious. You know, the West Midlands will not escape that. The real question is what happens after that. So that will start to become apparent from October onwards. Where it goes after that is a big open question. We'll get the first estimate of the West Midlands GDP sometime in 2022. We'll get more accurate GDP estimates for the West Midlands from 2024 onwards, but that will continue to be affected by COVID for some time. So it will really be the latter part of the decade before we even begin to understand the impact that Brexit has had on GDP in the region. That's an awful long wait, and the process will continue to play out for some years after that. So if there are any questions, please bring them to me, but I shall stop sharing now, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that. Very good presentation there. One thing that did occur to me in terms of the work that we've been doing, of course, is when you talk about the distinction between large firms and small firms in terms of how they're coping with the new trading landscape. I think one of the key things that came out for me is that larger firms, you know, the multinationals who are typically trading across the world anyway, already have the in-house expertise to deal with customs and the likes, whereas your smaller businesses, if they were just trading within the EU, don't. And I think that was one factor that sort of came up in terms of touching on manufacturing. I think Dave will elucidate this further, but the automotive sector, of course, had a certain grace period in terms of having to demonstrate compliance with rules of origin provisions, which, of course, for items with lots of parts and components can prove quite tricky. So that'll be interesting to see how that pans out once that period expires. We'll keep questions to the end, of course, to remind you that you can post questions on our chat page, and our panelists, of course, can check them up there and perhaps reply to you directly on that fora. But we'll leave general discussion till then. I want to move on now and bring Professor David Bailey into the conversation. Of course, David, again, is well known to many of you out there in terms of his contribution and his profile in the region, and of course the UK for his expertise on the automotive sector in particular. But of course, David, who works at the Birmingham Business School over at UAB, good friend of the centre for a long time, and yes, I don't think I need to revisit David's accolades again, but I'll let him do that himself if he so chooses. So David, over to you, and I look forward to hearing your conversation as well today.
Thanks very much, Alex, and nice to follow on from David. Excellent presentation by David. I thought he covered a lot of the ground I was going to cover, actually, so it makes it easier for me. And just to stress that in terms of Brexit's impact on the economy, just to echo David, this is going to take a long time to work out. So we saw that massive hit in January in terms of trade with the EU in imports and exports. That was clearly a temporary thing because it was so enormous, it was unprecedented. We've then seen something of a bounce back. But all the economic sort of modelling has said that actually Brexit is a long-term impact. If you put in place trade barriers, and that's what Brexit has done, there may not be tariff barriers if rules of origin rules are complied with, but there are non-tariff barriers, despite what Boris Johnson says, and they're significant. And so because of that, Brexit is going to act as a long-term drag on trade and therefore growth in the economy. In the long term, as Alex was alluding to earlier, much greater than COVID. Now, we have a vaccine for COVID. We don't have a vaccine for Brexit. Now, what that means actually is that the real impact of Brexit is only really going to be seen as firms in every sector, but particularly the case in manufacturing, we can take the case of automotive, rejig their value chains. So as they deal with this extra trade friction, they'll start to look at their supply chains, their value chains, where they locate things, where they invest. And that's going to be a long, drawn-out, long-term process. So David was absolutely right in saying, look, we're not going to be able to disentangle this for quite some time. What it does mean, though, in terms of the broader economy, Vicki may come back to this, is that we saw that big hit from COVID last year, something of a recovery. We're likely to see rapid growth in the economy this year and next. The OBR forecasts beyond that are that we're then back to pretty lackluster growth of about 2% a year, reflecting wider poor productivity growth in the economy, but also that Brexit drag kicking in long term. So Brexit is a long-term impact, and Brexit hasn't been done. The impacts of it are going to be felt for a long time. Right, focusing a bit more on manufacturing, much more positively, the CBI survey this week pointed to the sort of most rapid growth in manufacturing, really since records began in 1975. Remember, this is from a low point because of the impact of COVID and Brexit uncertainty, I'd argue, over the last few years, over the last year in particular. So output increasing across 15 out of 17 subsectors, led very much by motor vehicles and transport, and also food, drink, and tobacco. Motor vehicles particularly impacted last year during COVID, where most of the industry shut down, so it's now bouncing back from a very low level. Order books looking positive, exports looking positive to a degree, but stock adequacy the worst on record, reflecting disruptions in supply chains and output prices set to grow rapidly. What's interesting in looking at those figures, though, is that Brexit seems to have constrained the manufacturing recovery. So while the export order balance is up, that's the survey data from the CBI, many manufacturers are still reporting orders lower than normal. Of course, what normal is, given all of the turbulence that David pointed to, is an open question. So that might be a perception issue for manufacturers. But it seems to me that Brexit is actually constraining the recovery to a degree. Similar figures from Make UK last week, which showed that output volumes in the last quarter are at the highest level in about 30 years in terms of intentions, and employment looking very positive. So that Make UK forecasting rapid growth for manufacturing this year of about 7.8% compared with 7.5% in their forecast for the broader economy. That's the positive bit. The negative bit is that we're seeing a lot of supply chain disruption linked with COVID, also the impacts of Brexit, considerable cost pressures, staff shortages for a number of different reasons that we can explore. That might be people not choosing to come to the UK anymore from the EU. It might be because people have withdrawn from the labour market. And what that points to, I think, is that price pressures really do loom. Now, David rightly noted that actually we haven't yet seen the customs checks on imported manufactured goods and components. UK deferred those until the later part of this year. So if you're, say, Nissan, assembling a new Qashqai up at Sunderland or Jaguar Land Rover here in the West Midlands, you're bringing in parts from all over Europe, putting them into UK assembled cars. At the moment, customs checks don't apply on those imported components. So the possible delays from customs checks on inbound supply chains is yet to be felt. Now, what that means is that the big manufacturers, as Alex was saying, have got time to prepare for this. They should be okay, although it will mean extra costs because they're going to have to stockpile some components as a buffer for possible customs delays. Where I think we've really seen the impact already is on the UK supply chain, which supplies into EU suppliers and EU assemblers. They've faced real difficulties in getting goods out of the UK into the EU, having all the documentation in place. Delays have meant that they've struggled in some cases to meet really tough just-in-time requirements. And just to give you a kind of extreme illustration, GK Automotive, based here in Erdington, fantastic company. Those of you with a sort of local knowledge of history will know it goes right back to the days of Hardy Spicer and the invention of the constant velocity joint, which their products are in something like 80% of cars sold worldwide. You know, fantastic Brummie manufacturing success story. GK Automotive is shutting down their operation in the UK. Now, they say it's because of efficiency, which of course is a broad issue. I point to the fact of a lack of investment in that plant over years, partly linked to uncertainty over Brexit, I'd argue, but also because we highlighted this operation throughout the Brexit negotiations as an example of the complexities of supply chains across Europe, how parts come into Birmingham from the UK, Spain, France, Portugal, Italy, Germany, go into an assembled drive line. They then might go into a car assembled in the UK or in Germany and then back to the UK. Parts could cross the channel 4 or 5 times. That operation is simply extremely vulnerable post UK leaving the customs union, and that the need for checks. So I'd argue that Brexit is a factor, from my point of view, in that GK decision to shut their automotive division in Birmingham. That's going to have a long-term implication in terms of the development of electric drive lines, and also in terms of, coming back to Alex's point, about the content in, say, a Jaguar car made in the UK. Not so much in terms of sales for the EU, but if we've got a trade deal with Japan, that is going to require a degree of local content in the UK. There's going to be issues for UK-based manufacturers in making sure they've got enough UK content, because EU content doesn't count when it comes to, say, a Jaguar car being sold into Japan. So there's an implication for trade with third countries. So key point, Brexit, I think, whilst it's had an impact on supplies, it's a longer-term implication in terms of readjustment of value chains. Of course, there's big changes taking place in manufacturing anyway, in terms of the shift towards Industry 4.0, digitalization, and in the auto industry, the shift towards electrification. Now, the Brexit trade deal itself has had an impact on that. David alluded to how investment had been stymied post-referendum, investment in the UK car industry down by at least 50% over the last few years. That's hampered the UK industry's ability to actually invest in the technology for electrification. So we're now having to play catch up in the UK. There's been some good news post-Brexit trade deal, for example, Nissan going ahead with Qashqai production, but still some huge question marks about the likes of Vauxhall at Ellesmere Port, where Brexit is part of the factor in terms of deciding whether to invest there and keep production going. The other big factor is the government's 2030 target for electrification. So the owners of Vauxhall, now Stellantis, this massive supergroup that includes Vauxhall, Peugeot, Citroën, Fiat, want to see greater support from the UK government in terms of the support to encourage people to switch over to electrification and some flexibility over what hybrids means. So that's another point about Brexit. The government in the UK have taken back control, as it were. There is a degree of more flexibility from EU state aid rules, although we never really explored that properly when we were in the EU. But now we've taken back control. What sort of industrial policy do we have? What are we going to do to support domestic manufacturers? And that still isn't clear from the government. A withering assessment by Lord Heseltine that's on the BBC website today, an excellent piece by Simon Jack, where Heseltine takes apart the government in terms of its industrial policy and support for manufacturers. That contrasts, by the way, very much with support we've seen for manufacturing in other European countries. Now, we have seen support in the UK for business in terms of the furlough scheme, absolutely critical in protecting jobs in the economy and in manufacturing. But we haven't seen the degree of strategic intervention in the UK that we've seen in other European countries, rightly or wrongly. We've seen the French government intervene in terms of loan guarantees for strategic manufacturers, a lot of support for the manufacturing base. Project Birch never really happened in the UK, apart from one intervention to support a steelmaker. So, and also what we've seen, for example, is European governments intervene to support car buying and orientate that towards buying of electric vehicles to really kickstart electric vehicle production. And we've not seen a kind of really holistic approach from the government in saying, how are we going to get to 2030 and encourage people to drive electric cars? Oh, and by the way, hopefully make them in the UK. Now, that kind of strategic vision has been missing. Similar issues coming up in terms of steel. Some of you will be aware of the trade remedies authorities having to make decisions about or recommendations about whether the UK keeps in place safeguards on imports of steel to give time to the UK steel industry to adjust. There's big debate at the moment in Parliament about whether those safeguards stay in place. And if they do, what we then do to support UK steel, or whether we take those safeguards away and expose British steel to sort of full-throated international competition. One final point, if I can, we're seeing a lot of political noise around the trade deals that are being done out with countries outside of the EU. And don't get me wrong, those are very positive. Trade deals are good for trade, and they're going to be good for our manufacturing sector. But let's just put them in context. The extra trade barriers we've put in place with the EU will have a far greater impact on our manufacturing base than the trade deals we do with other parts of the world. Two examples. The trade deal with Japan. Liz Truss really sort of made a big deal about the fact that British cheesemakers can now export cheese to Japan. Well, put that into context. In 2019, British cheese exports to Japan were £100,000 in value. That's about the value of one top-end Range Rover. The trade deal with Australia, yes, very good news in terms of eliminating or reducing tariffs. That will be good for wine drinkers in the UK and for the likes of Jaguar Land Rover exporting to Australia, although issues for farmers. But just bear this in mind. Last year, Jaguar Land Rover made around 426,000 cars, down on previous years because of COVID. Sales in Australia, and I managed to get these figures from VFAX in Australia, out of 426,000 cars made last year, sales in Australia were less than 8,000. About 6,000 Land Rovers and over 1,000 Jaguars. So Australian sales of Jaguar Land Rovers is 1.87% of total Jaguar Land Rover output. So even if we see exports of Jaguar Land Rovers to Australia double, which I hope they do, that's still only going to be about 3.75% of total Jaguar Land Rover sales. My point is, yes, that's good news, but it isn't going to compensate for the hit to trade with the EU. And just to reiterate, we need a much more supportive industrial policy from the British government if we're going to value manufacturing in the UK going forwards after Brexit. Thanks very much, Alex.
You're welcome, David. You're welcome. You read my mind there on several occasions. So maybe talk us through this, because I think it's always worth reiterating this point about the way that production amongst multinationals tends to be regionally concentrated. If you take Toyota as an example, they have 14 production companies in the Southeast Asian region. So if the UK, for argument's sake, is granted membership of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, of which, well, the key economy, of course, is Japan, which you already have a trade deal with, a grouping which accounts for about 8% of UK trade. Do you really see UK manufactured items, principally vehicles, etc., being significantly increased in their volume to that neck of the woods, given that said companies operating in the UK operate there anyway?
Not in the mass market. I mean, I think there may be scope at the top end for, you know, Rolls-Royce, Bentley, top end Range Rovers. There is a preference amongst buyers in China in particular for European and British made top end cars. So
yeah, they're not a member of the TPP.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a separate issue.
Yeah,
Anyway.
But I think for the upper premium luxury end, yes, but that's small sales. It isn't going to boost the mass market, given that the mass producers are anyway producing in that region at probably much lower labour costs.
Yeah, I suppose my concern here is that the government's desperation to get trade deals appears that it may well come at almost any price, if you think of in terms of, as you mentioned, safeguards for UK manufacturers and farmers. Would you share that view?
Well, I think trade deals will probably be beneficial for UK manufacturing, but it's not going to be massive, given that those economies are a long way away. Agriculture raises a whole set of different issues in terms of standards, environmental standards, animal welfare standards, and so on, and that's clearly an issue. I think sort of connecting these up, I think there's this broader issue of what does that rather vacuous phase global Britain mean? If Brexit means we can now cut trade deals with different parts of the world, then there will be implications for various domestic industries, including agriculture. And to what extent the high standards, environmental standards and animal welfare standards that we have here are protected or undercut through trade deals with other parts of the world. So that, you know, there will be consequences of these trade deals.
Yeah, I mean, that's a classic point, isn't it? I mean, the UK at the moment, in terms of environmental standards, adheres to the EU's precautionary principle, which of course is the reason why we have a kerfuffle around hormone-treated beef potentially coming in from Australia.
Yeah, there is, and also we'll need to collaborate with the EU on this anyway going forward. So, you know, if you think about the emissions trading scheme in the UK, that needs to be linked with the EU's. When it comes to emissions regulations for automotive, we've effectively had to cut and paste EU regulations into UK law to make sure that car makers have an incentive to sell electric vehicles in the UK. So we are going to have to collaborate very closely with the EU on environmental issues, because in the most fundamental sense, externalities cross borders.
Indeed, but I suppose that the implication of what you're saying there is that the scope for the UK to deviate away from those benchmarks may not be that great.
And the further we deviate, the greater the cost. And that will be the case in a number of different areas. So if we think about the aerospace industry, at the moment, there is within the trade deal, the chance of sort of mutual recognition of each other's certification. That only works if standards are the same. If standards deviate, that doesn't work.
Yeah, I won't touch then on the issue of the chimera of a trade agreement with the United States. And I'll go over to Vicki now. So thank you for that, David.
Thank you.
Brilliant as always. Thank you. Okay, so introducing our final speaker for this morning then, Professor Vicki Price. Of course, Vicki, another good friend of the centre, has a rather prestigious history in terms of her contribution to government through BEIS and so on. So without further ado, Vicki, I'm going to pass over to you. So thank you.
I hope you can see me and hear me. I'll have a bit of a sort of dodgy internet if you can.
No, you're loud and clear. You're loud and clear at the moment. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, my remit was to look a bit more widely on what the implications of Brexit are. And of course, I look at Europe. The interesting thing is that Brexit has, if anything, concentrated the mind and has killed off the desire for many countries that we're talking about it before to leave the EU. I mean, we've seen the different stance now by Marine Le Pen, who has completely dropped from her new party the pledge to leave the euro, leave the EU. We've seen that also disappearing from anything as Salvini, who's head of the Liga in La Liga in Italy, is also gone. Now the right-wing party in Austria, which really want to get out of the EU, really is also no longer in power. We've seen the Poles and the Hungarians who had been talking a little bit about the concerns about the EU actually having stopped talking about anything of that sort, but of course they have their own demands. But if anything, the fact that the UK has had the difficulties that we've just been discussing has meant that there's very little willingness of anyone else to really test the system in any significant way, even though there are still quite a lot of resentments about the way it is run. And we've seen that happen with some of the former Eastern European countries having difficulties. The Southern European countries have complained for some time that we're not getting sufficient funding. But what is now happening is that this is changing. First thing, though, to point out is that, of course, a lot needs to happen in Europe still. It was a constant refrain of the Brexit campaign that Europe isn't working, if you like. And it's true that after the Eurozone crisis, things didn't really work out particularly well. And we had countries like Italy, for example, whose GDP per capita was still pre-pandemic, just at the edge of the end of the previous decade, below where it was at the time of the financial crisis. So that was been a real problem. Indeed, a recent survey by the European Council of Foreign Relations is suggesting that a majority of Europeans still think that Europe needs a bit of fixing, which of course, probably if you ask the citizens of the UK, they would say the same about the UK or any of the citizens about their own country across Europe. But if you look at the Eurobarometers, which are done quite regularly, what they're suggesting is that overall the satisfaction with the EU is at the highest level. It's been almost ever, and also strangely enough, because of course the euro itself can be considered to have been the main reason why it was so difficult to cope with the financial crisis in Europe, satisfaction with the euro has also gone up. So what we're finding therefore is that Europe is moving forward, in fact, with greater integration, is rethinking its stability and growth pact to avoid some of the austerity problems that we saw before. Even Greece now can sell its government bonds to, in the secondary market anyway, to the European Central Bank, and receives quite a lot of support that it didn't receive before. And as it happens, I'm talking to you from Greece right now. But Europe is an unfinished building site, we can call it that. And it's a series of treaties, and those treaties, of course, are something, of course, that we have signed as well in terms of our withdrawal agreement, which we're now in danger of throwing away, if you like. But Europe is looking ahead. There is a future of Europe consultation. David Bailey already mentioned what is happening on the climate change front in Europe, and there is a huge amount of funding now going into developing Europe, but also in relation to what it may mean for the UK. What we're finding is that there is greater integration. Europe is trying to flex its muscles. It knows full well there is a problem in terms of its overall standing in relation to the US and China, and is moving ahead probably faster than we can do with the amount of money that's been pledged so far in all sorts of areas of future growth, whether it's green investment or others. And it's interesting also in relation to electric cars, where of course they're trying to have perhaps a unique selling proposition there. So we may well find that we're left behind from not being able to be in there and perhaps partake in what Europe wants to do. Now, of course, if we had been in there, we might have objected to some of the funding that's going to various countries. We may have objected to the huge amount of quantitative easing that's going on, even though, of course, we couldn't control it because that's the European Central Bank. And we would have thought perhaps differently about what the priorities need to be. But we're not there, and they are moving ahead. But not being there has also reduced our standing in a way. We're not there to understand what's happening. You hear on the radio or any blogs that you've seen from previous ambassadors to the US, for example, who say that our standing, despite the sort of handshakes or touching of elbows that we saw at the G7 between Biden and Boris Johnson, that our influence is now quite significantly reduced. And of course, if you add to that our decision to cut the percentage of overseas aid that we give every year to developing countries, which is pretty controversial. Of course, we must remember that some of that aid, although a lot of it is going to assist in health areas and education and so on, a lot of it also pays for particular civil servants, perhaps, or particular public sector bodies, pays for the staff for them, which of course, again, gives you influence. And we're taking that away probably at our peril. The next thing, though, to move to is what does it actually mean for the UK, both in the short and the medium term? obviously losing influence matters in terms of whatever multilateral agreements there may be, whatever happens on climate change and so on. But we are moving ahead as far as we can with those trade deals that have been mentioned by both David's, of course, and which were questioned too by Alex. And we do know that this new, if indeed we get the agreement, because there are some countries that perhaps don't want us in it or haven't even been prepared to sign the agreement properly. That's the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, as it's known, which is quite a mouthful. Of course, we already have agreements with 7 of the countries that are in there. So yes, in terms of size, they're about the same in terms of the numbers of people that are covered by it to the EU. But as we've been hearing, their impact is really quite small in terms of trade for us. And the only real new trade deal, I mean, we've been doing quite a lot of rollover agreements so far since leaving the EU. We've basically taken most of the agreements and extended them with some small changes. But the only new one so far has been with Australia. Of course, the EU started negotiating with Australia in 2018 and also with New Zealand. And of course, the EU is now accelerating its own intentions to do something with India and other regions. And that, of course, is, if you remember, something that Boris Johnson was very keen to do as well, start proper negotiations with India. And some people are attributing the fact that we didn't close our borders to the expectation that there would be a visit and a trade visit happening with India, but it didn't actually happen at the time. So on the UK front, well, uncertainty has been removed. We talked about what happened to willingness of companies to invest since the Brexit referendum. Uncertainty has been sort of removed as a result of at least having an agreement, even though it looks like very much hard Brexit. So at the end of the transition period, and we've moved forward, we've seen sterling recover a little bit as well as a result. But if you look at the investment data for the first quarter, they still show, of course, a fall. And I think the government is hoping that with their super deduction that they announced in the March budget, that some of that may be reversed. But as we all know, looking at long-term series, all that does generally is bring investment forward rather than lead to loads of additional investment. And that we see therefore a slowdown after that. And of course, we have corporation tax rates going up to 25% in 2023, which might act as a disincentive. But what we are also seeing is that there are problems right now. There has been the work from the Centre for European Reform, which looked at similar countries and what they were doing since the Brexit referendum, and found that if things had stayed where we are, we probably would have been selling something like, or at least trade with the EU would have been something like 10% higher. So we may have just lost that, which is, of course, an issue. And additionally, the FDI issue, foreign direct investment, which is a concern if we're no longer a gateway to Europe, and David Bailey is quite correct to be concerned about this. What seems to be happening is that despite the removal of uncertainty, and also if you look at what was happening just before and compare our stock markets, even through the pandemic, with what has been going on, for example, in the US, what we're finding right now is that maybe our shares are undervalued, possibly, but certainly stock markets haven't had the same upward showing that others have done. And buying UK companies seems to be quite cheap right now. So loads of M&A activity, a lot of it from US private equity and others. Companies going private, which is quite interesting when they get bought. Quite a lot of opportunities for firms to pounce into the UK, rather than a lot of direct investment taking place. And I'd like to hear later from David whether he thinks that could be reversed. The good news about Nissan, but obviously an awful lot more needs to be done. And just 2 things to finish on trade. I listened to David Hearn's points with great interest, but of course, just to remind us of the figures that in if you compare Q4 2020 with Q1 2021, trade in goods with EU countries, excluding precious metals, fell by 20%, while that with non-EU countries fell by 0.4%, which does give you, of course, an EU component. But the more worrying thing is the concern of companies. Yes, of course, focusing on exports is an interesting one, because those are the export areas that are affected more rather than imports, where we don't have controls, just like David was saying. But when you look at ONS work, Office of National Statistics, which reported quite recently in terms of the difficulties that companies had, it was the first attempt, in my view, to separate the pandemic impact from the Brexit impact by doing surveys of firms and asking them what sort of difficulties they had and can they tell us whether it's Brexit or the pandemic. And it's really interesting on exports, the pandemic impact at the end of the transition period, because of course we had been suffering for quite some time from this, was something like 30%. So companies were saying that 30% of companies were saying they were experiencing difficulty in exporting because of the pandemic. There wasn't demand there or whatever. Countries had closed, supply chains had disappeared, etc. And that has fallen now in April, had fallen by April to 10%. The interesting thing is that Brexit over the same period went up, Brexit effect, from 10% to 60% and stayed really quite high. It's about 56% now. The interesting thing, if you look at imports, where of course there wasn't really such a big deal, that was about 20% in December of companies saying that they had difficulties. And that went up to 56%, 60, and then down to 56%, so pretty similar to the export side. And that, of course, we know full well. VAT concerns, costs, companies in Europe are really wanting to export, problems with the fact that there are now non-tariff barriers in terms of moving things around. Our haulier industry is screaming. Cabotage has gone, so the non-tariff barriers are really seriously important. And then finally, of course, the impact on work and, of course, prices in a way, and possibly eventually wages. There was a report just a few days ago, which was done by a company called Indeed, which is a company, it's a recruitment company, where you sort of click for interest for work. And what they have calculated is that EU citizens seeking work in the UK, if you compare it with the levels in 2019 and you look at May 2021, they were 36% below what they had been in 2019, when in fact there was absolutely no change, or 1% below from, let's say, Ireland or outside the EU. And if you look at hospitality, care industry, warehousing, all those relatively low paid jobs, but which do require people to be here in large numbers, the interest was down by 41%. And of course, we know that companies are screaming. Even Brexit voting hospitality chiefs are saying, we need more of those EU people to come back, and can't we possibly give them some extra special visas? So problems are there, and they are in many ways mounting and need to be dealt with. And I think it would be very, very useful to discuss some of those further. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. Thank you as always for that. Can I just pick up there on the issue of tightness in the labour market? Surely the dare I say, devil's advocate argument for those sectors like hospitality and agriculture that are crying out about labour shortages because of the drop in numbers coming in from mainly Central Eastern Europe, I guess. Surely the answer to that is wages just have to go up then, or start offering more non-wage benefits, because hospitality is not really known for its generous working conditions, is it?
Well, you're absolutely right, of course. And indeed, the report suggests that pay in the hospitality sector has gone up by 18% in a year. But of course, what has happened, and so part of that must be EU related, because the hospitality sector has been coming to public broadcast outlets, and anyone who could listen outside that as well, to say that we can't meet the demand, and we do need more of those people. So the fact that even pro-Brexit people are saying, suggests to me that it is quite a big issue. But the second thing, of course, is that if you suddenly have this increase in demand, very substantial increase in demand after everything had been closed down for some time, or at least was pretty low, then it's inevitable that for a while there would be this shortage because people are in the wrong place, may have changed sectors, they may have involuntarily withdrawn from the market. I mean, lots of women have done that, for example, from the labour market because of needing to look after children for a while and coming back again. So you do need to do something to induce them to come back. So I think it's a mix of the two, but the fact that the hospitality sector is saying it so clearly suggests to me that there must be an issue there as well with EU workers going. But it's not that just there, it's construction as well. The interesting thing is that, of course, it differs from region to region. If I remember correctly, some data that we had put together that suggested that 26% of construction workers in London were from the EU. So obviously, if some of them went because of the pandemic and haven't come back, or they're not interested in coming back, and that what we hear is that they believe that the climate is such in the UK in terms of whether it's open to people from the EU or not, they find it inhospitable, so they don't apply. They might go somewhere else. And that could be a loss that we have for the longer term. And we do know from estimates by the Office of Budget Responsibility that actually, migration is good for the economy generally. And of course, we know it adds to productivity, but also that migrants as a whole are the only bit of the working population or the population that contributes positively to the exchequer. So we're losing out something there.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with the overall arguments around favouring migration, which is a migrant myself. But no, it's just I think to me one of the issues that came out of COVID-19 particularly was highlighting that the rather precarious nature of a big chunk of the workforce. 1 in 3, you could say, and the vain hope that having a lot more people being exposed to potentially or losing their job might have forced a shift in thinking away from the low wage, low skill economy that's characterized government attitudes over the last 10 years particularly. But I leave that more as a comment rather than a rejoinder. Just turning to the chat box now and seeing what viewers, listeners have been coming in with here. Can I pick up each of you on this point, please? I think we sort of alluded to it, but we've not really made a focus of it. I take this here from James. Kevin has made a similar point here. Britain's trade policy seems to be directed towards reorienting exports towards so-called fast-growing markets in Asia, etc., rather than markets closer to home. As pointed out, this won't replace the hit to trade with the EU, etc. But how is this compatible with net zero ambitions, given the inevitable carbon impact of trading in further flung areas of the world? So I may do the revolving door here and go back to David Hearn, please. Any initial thoughts there? David, hello. All right, I'll come back to David. Dave B, any thoughts there? Oh, you're there.
Sorry.
Good.
Yeah. Those are computer issues with clicking the mute button. I'm sorry.
No worries.
No, I mean,
carbon footprint.
Yeah, my take on all of this, as far as reorientating trade is concerned, is that trade is constrained by distance. There's all kinds of reasons for that. That's true in the goods sector. Fairly obviously, it costs money to ship things from place to place, but you struggle with time as well if you've got time critical goods moving from one place to another. But also, I'd point out that you've got the same is true in the services industry as well. You've got different languages, different standards, certainly very different languages with regards to fast-growing markets. But you've also got time zone differences that get in the way of such trade. So that's to my mind, that's a real issue there. As far as net zero and CO2 emissions are concerned, I think the impact will be smaller than a lot of people kind of fear. And I say that for two reasons. One is that we are going to have to reduce our reliance on oil in particular, but any kind of carbon sources, and that's going to be true for the shipping industry as anyone else. Most of the emissions there come from things coming into the UK. so imported goods, not exported goods. The second point in terms of exports is that the UK's exports have much less embedded emissions, if you like, than is true for a lot of domestic production in many of these fast-growing economies. You know, there's a huge amount of embedded CO2 in your average iPhone, just because of the nature of Chinese electricity production, because of the nature of Chinese energy policy. That's going to continue to be true for some time. It's much less true of things produced in the UK, ironically. So insofar as you're displacing domestic production there, you might well end up with a much smaller carbon footprint than you fear.
Yeah, so I suppose that if I pick on one particular product, of course, beef, you know, that the rearing of cattle in Australia or Brazil, of course, is significant environmentally at two levels. One, of course, the stripping of the rainforest, in particular in the Amazon, contributes massively to, you know, well, significantly, shall we say, to increase global warming, of course. And in terms of the landscape degradation, in terms of rainforest soils being very poor and thin. The second aspect, of course, with cattle is that they are big producers of methane, which is a far more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. But again, I don't particularly expect you to reply to that as such. David Bailey, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's some very good questions in the chat box. If you think about what the UK has done in reducing carbon emissions, we hold ourselves up as a country that has done very well has done relatively well in terms of reducing carbon emissions. Partly that was because we've stopped burning so much coal, but also because we've deindustrialized and we've essentially shifted manufacturing elsewhere. So we consume the products, aren't emitting so much carbon in terms of, you know, consuming them here, but of course the carbon is being emitted elsewhere. That's called carbon leakage. So one of the things that the EU is looking at now in terms of its carbon trading system is having a carbon border adjustment tax, where if stuff is coming in with high embedded carbon that David was talking about, there's a tax around the EU. Now that I think is something we're going to have to look at, essentially saying, look, if you're using lots of carbon, we're going to tax you because basically you're undercutting our more carbon friendly, environmentally friendly manufacturing base in the UK or the EU. And again, it's the point we're going to have to collaborate with the EU on that. Just to give you an example about steel, UK steel industry, or parts of it in particular, which use electric arc furnaces, which recycle steel, environmentally much better than some of the steel that's produced in China. We know that there's been an issue with Chinese steel being dumped on world markets at very low prices. Unless we maintain some sort of safeguard measure, I think we aren't going to give the steel industry in the UK a chance to compete. And a whole set of issues there. You know, we have increased energy prices in the UK, partly to save the planet. Not everywhere else has done that. So electricity costs in the UK probably double what they are in the EU, significantly higher than in the US. We've put the UK steel base at a competitive disadvantage. We've got to find ways of, and that's an issue for energy intensive manufacturing. We never really compensated manufacturing in the UK for that extra price of carbon. We could do it through lower labour taxes. We could do it through research and development support. We could do it through cutting business rates. All of that comes back to the need for a green industrial policy. So, you know, that the opening up trade is going to raise these issues. There are things we're going to have to think about in terms of carbon taxes at borders, but we also need a kind of green industrial policy to deal with it as well.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Yeah, come on, Vicki. I was coming over to you anyway.
It's interesting. Oh, sorry. I find it quite interesting that David was suggesting that, in fact, we should reduce the cost of energy to industry to make us less uncompetitive. And of course, it's true if the others aren't doing it. But the other countries are charging a lot less, which has been the case actually for quite some time. But of course, everyone is arguing that for all those issues, including the question of long distance trade, being resolved is a carbon tax which truly reflects the externalities and therefore a much higher overall cost of carbon and therefore cost of energy at the end of the day, which will have put quite a lot of pressure on quite a lot of the companies that rely so much or are energy intensive. So that's the one issue, that perhaps the world is going the other way. So the idea of giving, if you like, making life easier for producers here on the energy front, may just be a difficult one to sell if you really are trying to go to net zero. And that, of course, is a long-standing problem for us. And the second issue is that, if the EU goes ahead with their carbon border adjustment tax, it will affect us too. So I was reassured by David Hearn, who said that actually our carbon content, our emission content, isn't that great in our exports compared to others. So we may not be punished particularly, but that's an extra barrier, certainly, it will be an extra barrier to our trade with the EU.
Okay,
just to
thanks.
clarify, Vicky, I think we need to maintain high energy prices. Actually, just we've not compensated manufacturing in other ways. So we've increased costs quite rightly to save the planet, but we've got to think of other ways to help it remain competitive. So I would agree with you, actually.
Thanks, guys. Let's slight reorientation here. Andy has a question here regarding the polls. Doesn't Keir Starmer's acquiescence to the current deal and refusal to challenge or highlight Brexit adverse impacts mean that our media has also largely ignored it, and so the public is largely unaware of the adverse impacts? Dave Bailey, do you have any thoughts there?
That's a very good point. I'm not a polling expert at all, so I'm well outside of my level of expertise. Yeah, Labour did agree to the deal, and that, in a sense, without largely reading it, of course, because it was all done at the last minute. We're now seeing that this is a long-term, impact on the economy, a long-term drag on the economy, long-term repercussions. We need constructive opposition in terms of pointing out some of these issues. Now, of course, the issue for him is that he's seen as an arch Remainer, and the issue is in certain parts of the country, red wall seats. It keeps open the lines of attack from Boris that, well, you're just a Remainer. But, the clue is in the title, opposition. And we need a constructive, critical opposition to highlight some of these issues that are going to be a long-term drag on the economy and what we need to do about it in terms of minimising implications. So, voting to leave the EU is a perfectly respectable thing to do. I think once there was a referendum, we should have honoured it, given that people voted. But the government, which argued for this, have to own the consequences. And that actually is a negative impact on economic growth. Now, it wasn't all about the economy, it was about all sorts of other things. But we've got to be honest about what's the long-term impact and what can we do to minimise that damage, and there is economic damage, and try and do things differently in the future.
Yeah, I suspect Andy's question could well be posited much in terms of the government's handling of COVID-19 and the opposition's attitude of not playing politics. Well, you said it yourself, the business of being an opposition is to point out the shortcomings of policy in this regard. Vicki, any thoughts there?
Yeah, there was a recent poll which was in the Independent that suggested that possibly 4 out of 5 was quite high. I'm trying to remember it now. People in the UK that were asked thought that there is something wrong with the deal. It didn't mean that they necessarily wanted to rejoin, but they did think that the deal wasn't right, had left. There's been so much about fishing, which supposedly was going to be a sector that was going to benefit hugely from this, and yet it's been so negative in terms of what's been coming out of it. And also the concerns about agriculture now with the Australian deal, that may have made people think, well, were we better off perhaps before? But of course, as you said at the beginning, I think, Alex, the wish to rejoin is not there, certainly at this stage, but that there is now a much more general acceptance that things aren't going particularly well is beginning to become, I think, more of a reality. But that is a long way from saying that there is a willingness to rethink what we had done, but there is a willingness, I think, generally to rethink the deal.
Yeah, and
I think that's an important
I suspect
point.
the next 12 months might be the next 12 months may be pivotal in that regard. Sorry, David, just before you come back, it's very interesting something that David Hearn pointed out earlier, that it'll be 2024 before we get any meaningful analysis, certainly at the regional level, of the impact. By then, there will be another election. We could well have a different government, without wishing to put a probability on that. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think Vicki's point is really critical, because, you know, if this kind of degree of concern about the nature of the deal it grows, and the economic consequences come through, particularly in parts of the country where the effects are, the left behind places, which ironically may be the most impacted. I think that does raise some issues for the government in terms of how they handle that. I think at some point they're going to have to own the deal. Now, I think the issue is, how far down the road is that actually going to catch up with them? Will we have moved on by then, and this be in the kind of mist of history? I think that's going to be Boris's plan, really, to have moved on to other things.
Yeah, quite. Look, you made me think here of when you're passing mention of global Britain, and of course that the notion of Britain's place in the world. I struggle with that terminology, to be honest. I mean, what is global Britain? I mean, we have defence forces which are characterised by about 100 battle tanks, 100 fighter planes, and 40 attack helicopters. So whatever global Britain is, it's not the manifestation of hard power, because that is distinctly lacking. But can I move back here to Northern Ireland? I mean, just had a comment posted here. As a resident of Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Protocol is much maligned as an imperfect solution to retaining the integrity of the single market, of course. Yet the DUP and other unionists are calling for it to be scuppered, but not offering an alternative. If the DUP and others do not understand the implications of the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, what hope would normal folk anywhere in the UK have? A summer of discontent in Northern Ireland lies ahead, utterly depressing and dangerous. Thank you there for the observation. I could only say in that regard that when Theresa May was trying to negotiate a deal, of course, the DUP had the balance of power. So much of the current predicament they find themselves within, I think, is of their own making. So they need to face up there. Panelists, any observations on that point?
Okay, the only thing that I'd say, rather than making a political thing, is that if you're hoping that there may be more willingness of the EU to relax some of even the bureaucratic checks that exist at present, which affect, of course, our exports in particular, but also how imports and exports generally work, or to have a real agreement on the financial sector side, or to have, as you suggested, Alex, some guarantee about the data equivalence, data adequacy equivalence. Then what's going on with the Northern Ireland Protocol right now is not helping in that respect. So if anything, the situation has worsened in terms of the relationships between the two sides.
Yeah,
and that is worrying.
Yeah, and that highlights a key point here, Vicki, again, to come back to what you've all alluded to. The more the UK wish to pursue regulatory divergence from EU standards, and a very simple solution to much of the current issue around checks in Northern Ireland would be to adhere to EU agricultural standards, which I think would eliminate about the need for 80% of them. The more the UK wish to diverge from these standards, the more checks are going to happen. So, once you start entertaining the trade agreement with Australia or the ultimate, the United States, there's no realistic alternative to the protocol. The UK government need to pull their finger out and ensure they've got the infrastructure and the personnel in place to make that operate much more effectively, I would say.
Alex, can I kind of add a point there?
Yeah, go on.
Which is, I think we need to collectively, I suppose, move away from discussing Brexit as if Brexit means the situation we find ourselves in right now. That is simply not the case. Brexit, to come down to the definition of Brexit, is literally leaving the European Union. It's no more than that. It doesn't mean leaving the single market necessarily. It doesn't mean even not having a customs union with the EU. It can mean what you wanted within that very, very vague boundary of not a member of the EU. It can mean a whole spectrum of different things. And what we're talking about here is not necessarily what leaving the EU in itself entails, but the very, very specific and very, very particular agreement and set of agreements, because there's more than one, that the UK has signed up to, that the UK has made, or the British government, I should say, have made a series of choices. And it is, I don't think that rejoining in the sense of becoming an EU member in any realistic time frame is going to happen. I just don't see that as realistic. I think other countries would object beyond anything else. But more than that, that doesn't mean that you cannot have a better relationship than you have at present. And it certainly doesn't mean that you cannot have a better agreement than we have at present. And a lot of the problems in Northern Ireland would be immediately obviated if we signed up to the same sanitary and phytosanitary standards as the EU.
Indeed, and this picks up nicely on a comment here by Malcolm Harbour, which I will highlight to you all if you haven't seen it. He suggests, thank you for joining us, by the way, Malcolm. It's good to see you again there. If we put some serious effort into rebuilding EU relationships and sorting out the detail of our EU single market arrangements, perhaps picking up on your point there, David, this would surely lead to real economic benefits quickly rather than chasing Trans-Pacific Partnership membership.
Yeah.
Yes, very good point, Malcolm. You know, the gain from reducing some of these non-tariff barriers for the UK economy would be actually more significant than these welcome, by the way, trade deals with distant countries. You know, the bottom line is simple economic gravity models tell us that we are going to trade more with countries on our doorstep. Oh, and by the way, the EU is the largest single market in the world, and it's on our doorstep. So getting this relationship right is going to be critical for trade and growth. And I suspect it's going to dominate political debates for a long time, actually, going forwards.
Yeah. Vicki, any thoughts there?
Yes, before we get too carried away, of course, the Europeans are very keen on the integrity of the single market. So I think what they did say from the beginning is that you can't just pick and choose. You do this little bit and you know, we can be there in the single market part, but not there. And I think the freedom of movement issue is a really critical one. And you know, if we don't perhaps move in that direction, the likelihood of getting considerably better terms from Europe decreases quite significantly.
Okay, I'm conscious that we're nearly wrapping up on time here, so I'll ask all three of you again, thank you for your contribution, but each of you just for a brief final observation on the road ahead. Can I start with you, David Hearn?
Yeah, I don't think any wholesale renegotiation of what we've got right now is on the cards in the next 5 years, not just on the British side, but on the EU side. They want to make it work. They want to see it work. What we have the option for is certain easements, and we have the option to try and rebuild trust. And I think that will take gestures such as signing up to a veterinary and SPS agreement. That, to my mind, is the way forward. You remove a lot of the problems by doing that. That is the low-hanging fruit. Further away, 4 or 5 years plus, then you can start talking about other things, potentially rejoining the single market, which I think would need to be done in totem, couldn't be done in part.
Okay, Dave Bailey.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, I think clearly politically Brexit is seen to be done, but as we've been hearing today, it's actually not done, in the sense it's a long-term process with long-term economic consequences for our businesses, our industries, and our regions. What isn't clear to me is what Brexit was really for. Why did we do it? To take back control? Not really clear to me what we want that control for. I mean, leaving aside the fact we probably have much more flexibility in the EU than we admitted, but what did we want control for? And from my own point of view, in terms of manufacturing, we've now kind of scrapped an industrial policy. What sort of future do we want? I mean, those big questions are still out there. What sort of economy and society do we want post-Brexit?
Thank you. And Vicki?
Yes, well, I don't think anyone has the answer to that yet, David. What sort of society do we want to be in the future? And of course, there are such differences in terms of opinions, and that was also reflected in the voting patterns between regions. And what, of course, is in prospect is more trouble in Northern Ireland, in prospect also an independence referendum in Scotland. All these things will, if anything, since I started with my little contribution with the UK's position in the world, all that will diminish the UK's position. If you have those struggles happening and that uncertainty happening, then that also affects growth prospects in the economy. So unless there is some real rethink, I'm not fantastically optimistic that we're going to get back to anything more than just the very minor growth rates that we saw were being forecast and experienced just before the pandemic hit. And that means no real productivity growth, prosperity will suffer. And the UK, despite new trade deals possibly, will shrink in importance. So everything is needed. I don't quite know how we're going to get to it, but without that, I remain pessimistic.
Well, thank you, Vicki. I don't want to depart on that note, although I'm obviously sympathetic to it. Thank you all for listening, and thank you again to our panelists. If I could just make some final comments. Any listeners out there, if any of you are working in manufacturing and you have a good story to tell, I know that may be few and far between. We have Sarah Thompson from the Black Country Chamber of Commerce, who was looking to talk to businesses about any silver lining, shall I say, any good news that we sort of desperately seem to need. She's on the chat box there. I invite you to contact her directly in that regard if you're operating in the Black Country or indeed the wider West Midlands. In terms of going forward, in terms of our event series, we're going to take a break from events over the summer. I hope all of you out there get to enjoy some time in summer, and hopefully the restrictions we've covered, ease in the way that we want to see them do. In terms of our agenda, our schedule going forward, we'll have our next event on the 30th September, which we are billing as our annual conference. It is our intention to run that as a hybrid event, so that event will take place live at the old library in Birmingham. Watch our website in this space, and as we finalise our list of speakers, there is a vague chance, of course, that we'll have to do that still just solely online. But our aim is to have that run through both media. So we found this quite a good way of engaging with people, but we hope to have the best of both worlds going forward. And of course, in itself, it'll be interesting to see by then, whether we have a clear insight into the impact on the region and what will happen going forward. And so on that note, thank you once again for joining us. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you, Georgia, for the technical support. And I hope you have an enjoyable rest of the day. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.